All right, I'm here with Daniela Scur of Cornell University. Danielle, thanks for joining me. You've done a lot of work related to management and the impact of management on productivity. And I think this is obviously a very interesting literature for anyone that's concerned about management in the Global South. I'm going to ask you about a specific paper you've done on school management
Mhm.
titled Measuring and Explaining Management in Schools, New Approaches Using Public Data, that you've done with Claire Lever and Renata Lemos, that I think you guys are still working on.
Yeah.
So I'd love to just start out by asking you if you could tell me what was the research question that you were trying to answer as you were going into the study.
hmm Sure. And first, let me just say thank you for having me and also for the great work that you guys do. As I obviously think principals are really important for school quality. And so it's great to have organizations like yours that care about things like this. So starting with that, but on our paper, so we had two main challenges that we think academics and also practitioners face when they're thinking about school management. And that's where we started. And the two challenges are measurement and understanding the mechanisms, right, behind why we see that improved management practices might be good for student outcomes. Now, on the first one, we wanted to try and think about measurement a little bit more carefully. So the best measure of school management that we have at the moment is this data set of the World Management Survey, which, as you know, I've worked on for several years. And then there's a developing countries version of it, which is a development WMS. But the problem is that that data set isn't necessarily cheap to collect. And so we end up with really good data, but it's only been done in about 10 countries. And even within those countries, just 100 to 500 schools within each country, in the education sector, that is. And so the challenge here was that if we wanted to look at these mechanisms and understand what's going on, the first thing we needed to do was get a really big data set. And something that was large enough and had additional data on those mechanisms that we were trying to understand. And so we thought, how are we going to get this? It's really expensive to try and use the WMS to do so. But one set of, there's one set of data that we could use is all of these data sets that already exist. So for example, PISA, right? So many countries, and this is the PISA is from the OECD, but there's many countries that also do their own standardized tests and surveys and school censuses and so on. And a lot of these questionnaires include some questions that mirror the type of topics that we were trying to measure with the World Management Survey. And so what we started doing was basically, we started with PISA and we said, okay, PISA sort of is the Program for International Student Assessment from the OECD. So we started with PISA and identified the questions that were measuring elements of management practices that we would normally try to measure with the WMS. And then we built a new set of indices. Now, what's nice about that is that we can validate the index in the usual way, which is just seeing if it helps predict student achievement or something we care about. But the other thing is that we can validate this index, comparing it to the World Management Survey. And that's useful in terms of cross-country comparisons, right? Because one of the problems with these data sets is the self-reporting makes it so that cross-country comparisons are a bit harder. Not necessarily on the standardized tests. Those are, they take a lot of pains to make sure those are comparable, but more in the other survey responses, which is what we would use. Now, because we know the WMS is comparable across countries by design, what we can do with this index is can at least check whether there's similarities in some things like the distribution across countries and that pattern of management and student correlations that we would see in the WMS versus these PISA indices. So that's, and what's even nicer then is that because these large surveys have so much extra data, we can then also start thinking about these mechanisms. And in particular, what they have is teacher surveys. And so also school characteristics data, and sometimes even parents or student surveys. But for this paper, we were focusing on teachers. And so that takes me to the second question of the paper, which is trying to look into this black box that deals with teachers more specifically. And we build a framework that decomposes that impact of school management on learning in two parts. One that's going to be the intensive margin, and that would be so teachers, students, parents, already in the school and how they become more productive within the school. And one that's going to be the extensive margin, so getting the best teachers and students and parents to join the school. And in economics, another way we tend to think about this is the incentive effect and the selection effect. And then we use this data set that we built to then address the question. Now, which came before, it's chicken or the egg, but it kind of all came together.
Got it. So I'm curious to hear then, what are the kind of key results or key findings from the work?
So I think one of the key results that probably going to be a bit understated, but it's that we were successful in actually putting together this new measure. And we use PISA is the main measure we use, but we also did it with the Brazilian Prova Brazil, partially to show that it is doable with various other survey instruments, but also because Brazil is such a fantastic case, right? It has a trove of additional data we can use, and it's such an interesting country. It's so big and important with so much variation across states. So we wanted to do it with two separate types of questionnaires as well. And so, but in terms of the results themselves, what we find is that using the indices that we built, we see still this positive correlation between this management practices measure at the school level and student outcomes. In the overall, what we find is a 1 standard deviation higher management score is correlated with about 3 points higher in terms of the PISA test scores, which is equivalent to about a month's worth of learning. In slight differences across subjects, but essentially about a month's worth of learning in those subjects that they test. And, this isn't necessarily new. I think the literature has already shown that there's this correlation between management and student outcomes, and some studies have shown causal relationships. And so it's not new, but I think it reinforces what the literature is saying, in that it's nice to see this be robust across 65 countries, right? So PISA has 65 countries. So it's the first time we can actually see this across a lot of different places instead of just the original 10. And so the second set of results is that we link to our theoretical framework. And so when thinking about teachers and management practices, so we use the teacher questionnaires to develop an additional set of indices that will tell us something about selection and incentives, right? So we have our management practices, we have our teacher indices, and then we see what relationship we see between those based on our theoretical framework. So in particular, we have an index of teacher shortages, teacher motivation, and teacher effort. And so as you can see, this would speak to selection and then incentives. And we break the overall management index into one that's focusing on operations management and one that's focusing on people management. And what we find is that schools with better people management tend to report experiencing lower levels of teacher shortage, which is interesting, as well as higher motivation and higher teacher effort. Now, one thing I think it's always important to keep in mind that, the PISA and a bunch of these other data sets also have private schools in them. And so what was driving the private schools are the ones that have very high scores in people management. And that's primarily because I think they have this organizational latitude to do so, so we know that public school principals tend to be quite constrained in what they have the authority to do,
right?
Especially when it comes to hiring and personnel decisions, and they come from the top, and they tend to follow a pretty strict schedule of performance appraisals and rewards and so on. And so that's one of the reasons we wanted to break it up into people and operations, because public school principals do have a lot more autonomy to handle these operational points, even if there's some rubric that they need to follow. And so what we do is then look at the same set of outcomes, so teacher shortages, motivation, and effort, only for public schools. And in essence, there, what we're doing is assuming that everyone has a payment and personnel policy that's kind of similar. And then how is it that better operations management correlates with each one of these potential channels? And so, again, just for public schools, we find that having higher operations management is correlated with lower teacher shortages, higher motivation, higher effort. Different magnitudes, but the direction is the same. And because operations is also, another point here is that operations also likely to affect how the students and parents engage with the school, right? So when we're looking at people management, it's really direct with the teachers. But as I said, these data sets have student questionnaires and things that give a lot more richness to the model. And so we also build an index of household effort, and that's going to be for student and parental effort. And we find, again, there's a high correlation between, but at least a correlation exists between the higher operations and household effort, which we thought was pretty striking. So I think in all, it's always important to remember none of these results are causal, right? This is just correlations that we've been able to find with this new data set. But we think that this combination of having this theoretical framework and then a large new data set at least helps us be really precise, right, about the channels that link these management practices with student outcomes via teacher selection in this case, and teacher and household incentives. And so we see that come through in the data, which I think is quite neat, and help us think through management interventions and why changing one thing or another might actually improve learning as we go through it.
Interesting. Can you say a little bit more about like what is people management and what is operations management, and does that map to what you were talking about earlier in terms of the intensive and extensive margins? Or
well, no. So it wouldn't map directly necessarily onto the intensive extensive separately. They both feature on both of those margins. The difference between operations and people is just that operations is all of the more procedural things about the school. So, do they have standardized lesson plans that they use, or do they kind of come up with them by themselves? If they do come up with them by themselves, is there any sort of process to make sure that different classrooms are sort of following similar things or following the curriculum? Do they have any sort of monitoring in terms of how students are doing or how teachers are doing, more in a school sense? And basically all of those types of more operational things about the school, day-to-day activities. Whereas people management is very much about the incentives and selection of teachers, and quite squarely on that relative to the operations.
Got it. And so for the public schools, the people management, the components of people management that you all are talking about generally don't fall within the remit of the school level leadership.
Yeah, so in general, the ones that we find on the PISA and these other questionnaires wouldn't really be something that the principal has direct authority over in terms of the selection, for example, right? But what we find with the WMS, and that's the nice thing about having the WMS data, is that we ask about more than just, do you actually pay your teachers more, right? So there's questions about non-financial rewards and how do you identify that you have good teachers in place, and who's sort of a good teacher, who's not doing so well. And that identification we found is actually quite important, because it's the first step to being able to do anything about it, right? So having really good teachers, if you can identify who the best ones are, you can then set up some sort of mentorship program within your school if you can't get it from the outside, or if you think it's better to do it from the inside, or you can reward the good teachers for their good work. It doesn't have to be money. It can be other types of rewards that often matter quite a bit as well. And if you can identify the ones that are struggling, that's the first step to try and get them to do better, right? And so I think that there's often a misconception on what the World Management Survey and other surveys like this consider as sort of good people management. It's definitely not an idea that everybody who doesn't do really well in a particular performance metric needs to be fired. It's actually the opposite. It's quite costly to have turnover. So you do want to try and help people improve when they're already in the organization. But we also need to, you need to balance that against the fact that if a student has 1 year of a teacher who's underperforming, that's carried through for the rest of their school career, right? So it is something that needs to be timely. It's not necessarily firing the teachers, and that's, I think, one of the problems that people sort of keep running up against, is this idea that if a consultant comes in, it's they're going to fire everyone. But in the sense that we're talking about these management practices is much more about identifying where you need to work on and how to then set a process that allows you to get through the problem.
So you started kind of going into this a little bit, but I'm curious to hear what you think are the key implications of your work for organizations like Global School Leaders that works directly with school principals or school leaders. And there's many orgs like GSL. So what was kind of the implications of your work for orgs like ours?
Well, I think you definitely touched on it. So I think the first one is actually that people management seems to matter quite a bit, right? And then, and even if, as I was saying, for public schools, it's not feasible to necessarily carry out, any sort of wide-ranging reform, and sometimes you don't even need that. It's just, if the system isn't yielding the results that you're hoping for and you can't reform it, then there's still some things that you can do in following some sort of a systematic approach that allows you to assess the strengths and weaknesses of the organization, and then pinpointing how to solve them. And I think that's for public schools, and private schools have a lot more bandwidth, right? What they can do. I have colleagues who have worked a lot on paper performance and which shades of paper performance actually work, because some of them don't, right? It's not necessarily a lot of the teachers that are in the teaching profession. They're doing that because because that's what they love to do, and so they care. And I think there's a balance that can be struck often by private schools, which is why we see private schools having just so much people management scores that tend to be a lot higher. But that's not to say that public schools can't do it, and we've seen a lot of public school principals that we've heard about and we've heard from, who find ways, to make sure that their teachers are feeling valued and everything. And so I think it's about creating a culture that says we care about our jobs, we care about our children that we're trying to teach, and we'll work together to try and pull each other up and make sure that it works. And having clarity in that system, I think, helps everybody understand their role and how to actually make that happen. And I can highlight this one case, and I mentioned Brazil earlier because Brazil is such an interesting place, but the World Bank just came out with a note, and I think it was David Evans who was putting it on Twitter, that they were putting together the story about this one municipality that's quite famous in Brazil. It's called Sobral, and they did this massive turnaround. And a lot of it was down to a shift in culture that shifted into no excuses. We're going to do things right. They set some very clear structures, very clear expectations, and said, this is how we're going to do things. We're going to work to this standard now. If you don't like it, you can leave. But this is the standard now, and this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to expect this of you. And then, listening to the principals there, and the mayor of the city, and like the Department of Education in their area, is just fascinating. It's great because it really was a culture shift. And I think it's this vision, and then specifically to the point of what can the school leaders do. It's the vision of the school and the vision of the leader, and the consistency of that vision, and the policies and practices that are carried out that go along with that, that sit squarely in this realm of responsibility that the school principal and the school leaders have, right? So they're the drivers of all of this.
Interesting. I'm curious to hear what you think the next kind of frontier of research question should be, particularly as it relates to school leadership.
Well, obviously, everything I'm working on. No, so I love that question, because it's one of the biggest questions in organizational economics is why we see such massive productivity differences across seemingly similar organizations. And you want something more homogeneous at the surface than schools. And I think it's actually I think it's the first sentence in the seminal paper from Gibbons and Henderson, and a chapter in the Handbook of Organizational Economics. And I think in the case of schools, we've really just started scratching the surface of understanding the pathways that lead to this massive difference. I think we learned a lot about teacher characteristics that matter. And importantly, I think we've learned a lot about what doesn't matter. And we've also learned a lot about students and the background and how much that matters and how much parental involvement matters. But I think we're also learning now about these organizational structures and how they provide almost like a scaffolding, I think, to the way I think about it as a scaffolding that that allows all these working relationships within, and these actors within the school, and even from without the school. And I think we're hoping that this big data set is going to let more people think through how these structures affect their context, and they'll get the data and see what else comes out. And the role of the leaders, as I was saying, I think is in pushing through this change is never easy. And I would love to understand more about the principals who are actually able to do it. And more importantly, even when they do, if we can start seeing things at a longer scale, changes that were implemented by a principal who then left, or by a municipal government that then changed hands, and the longevity of those things, that have these changes become a part of the school and a part of the culture of that organization, even if the implementers left, and how that kind of happens, and how can we make that change be something more sustainable. And so I think this is super exciting to work on. I'll do my best to keep at it. and organizations like yours just make it so that it's worth doing stuff like this. So
Yeah.
thank you.
No, great. Thank you. Fascinating stuff. And thank
Yeah.
you for taking the time to share your work with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Great.